What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all doing well. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to click here on another video. And we're going to be talking about the latest film coming from Marvel Studios. It's been pretty heavily anticipated by a lot of Marvel fans, and that film is called Thunderbolts. Directed by Jake Schreier, this film stars an all-star cast of people like Florence Pugh, Sebastian Stan, Hannah John Kamen, David Harbour, Lewis Pullman, and many more. And before we get too far into this video, if you guys are a fan of early reviews like this, as well as up-to-date reviews, live streams, retrospective reviews, and all sorts of other fun and movie-related content, you're in the right place. Consider subscribing. But if you're a returning viewer, thanks for coming back. I always appreciate it. And today, like I already mentioned, we're talking about Thunderbolts, which is a new film coming from Marvel Studios, which has been pretty heavily anticipated. I think in the world of a lot of mixed bag content in the world of Marvel and a lot of mixed bag responses to a lot of these films and projects that have been coming from the MCU. I think as we get closer and closer to the Avengers films that the Russo brothers are getting back into the director's chair to do, I think people just want to see these films kind of start to get better, start to kind of pull things together and make it feel like we're leading towards an Avengers film. And I honestly think that the Thunderbolts does just that. I actually really enjoyed this film. I liked a lot about it. There are some things I have some gripes on, and we're going to get into that in just a little bit. But before we get into my thoughts on the film, let's get into what this film is all about. And don't worry, this is a spoiler-free review. Thunderbolts focuses on a slew of various characters from the different Marvel films that we've gotten in the last 5 to 6 years and combines them all into a group. I don't want to give away too much about the plot synopsis, but what you have here is a group of ragtag individuals from different Marvel projects that in a lot of ways have either been kind of thrown aside villains or anti-heroes, or probably the biggest name in the bunch is the Winter Soldier, Bucky, played by Sebastian Stan, with the rest of them being characters that we've seen in a couple of projects here and there. The next biggest one, and the one who leads this film, is Florence Pugh as Yelena, of course the sister to Black Widow, who we saw in Black Widow. And outside of just her coming from Black Widow, you also have David Harbour returning as Red Guardian, as well as Olga Kurylenko as Taskmaster. Outside of them, you also have the US agent played by Wyatt Russell returning for the first time since Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Hannah John Kamen coming back to play Ghost for the first time since Ant-Man and the Wasp. You also have a new character in the mix known as Bob, played by Lewis Pullman, that I don't want to say too much about, but a lot of the film does definitely center on him. And then the one character that kind of brings them all together is the character of Valentina Allegra de Fontaine, played by Julia Louis-Dreyfus. So you have a bunch of random MCU characters that are not some of the main big faces that people tend to think about from the MCU, but I think one thing that people have criticized the MCU for since the release of Endgame is the fact that we have so many characters now. There's so many TV shows, so many movies, there's so much to keep up with, and a lot of it doesn't really feel like it's connected as much as the MCU used to. It doesn't feel like all of these characters matter and all of these storylines matter. And so here we are now, and this film does a good job of taking a bunch of characters from a bunch of different stories, slamming them together, and giving us a new story here that also kind of sets up for what's to come. This is a film that has a mid-credit scene as well as a big post-credit scene that's definitely setting up for the events of films that we have in the near future and in the somewhat distant but also near future. So this is a film that's definitely kind of like planting its flag in terms of like, here's our own story, here's us bringing these characters from various projects together to kind of feel like we're connecting the universe more, but also here's a movie that's also going to very much open the doorway to a lot bigger storytelling moving forward, which I gotta say definitely excited me. I really enjoyed Thunderbolts. I found this to be a good fun time at the movies that ultimately, like I already mentioned, did a good job of bringing in all these pieces that just kind of felt like they were just left around, all these characters that they teed up and did nothing with, and this film does something with them. And I think you have an interesting group of characters here. You have a bunch of characters that have their own agendas, they have their own mannerisms, their own attitudes, and they're not necessarily here to save the world. They don't necessarily go into this film or the events of this film expecting to be the heroes, so to speak. In a lot of ways, this is the MCU's version of a Suicide Squad, if you will, a group of individuals who are not necessarily the nicest people. Some of them are anti-heroes, some of them have been flat out villains in previous storylines, some of them are just misunderstood, and I think that this film in general did a good job of kind of balancing all these different personalities and making it a film that feels tonally a lot more in line with what we saw pre-Endgame. This film kind of feels in line when tonally in terms of what we've seen with things like Captain America Winter Soldier or even Civil War. I won't necessarily say that this film is as good as those in terms of narrative or overall character depth, but I think in terms of tone, with a kind of a grounded, more serious approach while also kind of having some of that classic MCU levity, this film kind of struck that balance and definitely takes it back to what the MCU was before Endgame, where now we've had certain films that have been super comedic or things that are completely a little bit more goofy and feel a little bit tonally inconsistent with the franchise. I think Thunderbolts slides itself right into feeling very much like an MCU film that people knew to love back in the day. And I think the cast here is great. The main star of the film for sure is Yelena, the character played by Florence Pugh. She is the center focus of the film without a doubt. She's the character we most spend time with. She's the character that you kind of feel the most for throughout the course of the film. She's the character who I think goes on the biggest emotional journey throughout the course of the film. And I think that she does a great job leading the entire troupe here. I think she does a great job leading this film. The performances across the board are pretty great. And I think this film did a great job of giving these characters moments where you can actually think, oh wow, I like this character a lot more than I did on that previous project. One of the big key players here that I enjoyed a lot more here than we have in the past is the character of John Walker, US agent played by Wyatt Russell. I enjoyed what they did with his character in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Of course, he's meant to kind of be a Captain America 2.0. He's kind of meant to be an unlikable character, but here you have him at a little bit more of a vulnerable state. He's struggling with some things in his personal life. He finds himself mixed up with these people he doesn't want to be with, and there's some great levity that comes around his character, but he's also a character that I thought we got to dig a little bit deeper into. Definitely the funniest part of the film was David Harbour as the character of Red Guardian. He was funny in previous installments, but this film definitely gives him a little bit more time, specifically to also kind of play that father role for Yelena, which is kind of estranged. You know, they don't really have a great relationship, especially after the events of Black Widow. And so this film does a great job of kind of, you know, tackling a father-daughter dynamic, but he's also there for a lot of levity. I really enjoyed that as well. There were a couple of characters that I felt were underutilized the most. I'd probably say it was the characters of Ghost and Taskmaster. I think there are some cool moments with their characters, most notably Ghost. I think there's some great banter with her and some of the other characters, and they do some things to make her a little bit more of an endearing character. But I do think when I look at what they did with her in Ant-Man and the Wasp, one of the biggest criticisms people had was that they just didn't feel like they connected with her as much as a villain, even though you can see where she's coming from. I was hoping this film would make me feel a little bit more connected to her, and while it does to a degree, I think that she is the one of the main group of Thunderbolts here that we don't necessarily walk away from this film thinking, wow, I feel like I really have a new understanding of that character. Bucky is great as he usually is. I think Sebastian Stan has just consistently proven why this is such a likable and fun character, and I think here he definitely plays more of a straight man amidst all these kind of different personalities, very much, you know, leading into some of the sarcasm that Bucky is known for, but by no means being like a funny character. I thought he was a fun inclusion here that felt like we were still grounded in the MCU that we know, while also spending time with some characters that we're not necessarily as familiar with. Julia Louis-Dreyfus as Valentina is a character I'm glad we got a lot more time with in this film because, you know, between Falcon and the Winter Soldier and Wakanda Forever, she's a character that kind of just feels like she's been in the background, in the shadows, kind of pulling some of the strings. And while she has had some integral moments in the MCU so far, I think it would be an overstatement to say that she's been overly integral. And I think moving into this new phase, it seems like she's going to be a much bigger part. And it was nice to see her as kind of like a big antagonist in this film in a lot of ways. She's definitely, you know, an individual that you kind of have to watch out for. And I think that it was an interesting kind of dynamic to see her kind of work against the Thunderbolts in certain moments of this film while also working alongside them and others. And I think that she in general does a great job of kind of playing this very malicious, kind of conniving character. And without a doubt, it is definitely one of the better parts of the film. Now, one thing that the marketing has kind of a tease to and has shown is that there is another antagonist in the film. I don't want to say too much about it for those who don't want any spoilers, of course, but you can see this in a lot of the marketing. There is an individual who seems to be shadowing people, if you will, turning people into shadows. If you are familiar with the comics, of course, you are going to know that this is the character of the Sentry. And so when I saw that they were going to introduce him into this movie based on the trailers, I was pretty excited, but also kind of worried because he is a very OP character, very strong. And how do you integrate him into a story here with characters that are more boots on the ground kind of characters? These are not the super characters. These are not, you know, Captain America and Thor like characters. So how do you introduce a character that is so godlike in his powers? And I think for the most part, they do what they do with Sentry pretty well here. There are a couple of moments around his character that were a little bit goofy due to some of the green screen and CGI, but for the most part, on an emotional core with the character, I found him to be a pretty cool character. They give him meaning and reason to be where he is in the story. And I think he's also utilized in a great way to get the film's message across, which is about the darkness that lives within us and the notion that if you allow it to consume you, it ultimately makes your world dark. So yeah, if you know things about the Sentry character, you can probably see how they pulled from that, specifically with this other part of him called the Void. I don't want to say much more, but it was nice to see the Sentry in a live action movie in a way that ultimately I felt they did pretty well. I don't necessarily know that this fully conveys the character when I look at the character from the comics. There are definitely open doors to more storytelling around this character as time goes on, but it was nice to see the Sentry integrated into live action. And overall, I think that this film just did a good job of having its own story, having its own characters, having its own character arcs, not fully integrating it in every little bit. It's not really concerned with a bunch of cameos and this, that, and the third. There are references to the things that have come before, and of course the stories that these characters are from. More than anything, it spends time with these characters, allowing us to have some fun banter, some fun action sequences, sometimes where they're fighting against each other and they're fighting with each other. And this all leads to a third act finale that felt a lot more personal than it did big and bombastic and all about spectacle. There is that spectacle in this film, but it's not about that. It feels far more about a personal journey for these characters, most notably Yelena, and the other characters definitely have their moments. So I was really excited with walking out of this film and being positive on it. And when it comes down to the post-credit scene, I think it does what a lot of us have been wanting to do, which is kind of really just show us the path. What is the vision here? Where are we going? We have a lot of characters to kind of bring together before we get to the Avengers, which is pretty soon in the grand scheme of things. There's only a few more projects until we get there. We need to kind of get the ball rolling. And I think the post-credit scene for this film is definitely going to get a lot of people pretty excited for what's to come later this year and in the coming years. So that's going to be my thoughts on the film. Overall, I thought this was a pretty well-made film that's very well acted, has some great action sequences, has some great cinematography, the look, the feel, the vibe, the tone of it definitely felt like, again, pre-Endgame Marvel. While I don't necessarily know that the narrative here is as good as some of the pre-Endgame movies, I think it's definitely better than a lot of the more recent things we've gotten. I think that Captain America Brave New World, while I enjoyed it for what it was, definitely disappointed a lot of people, and it definitely wasn't on par with the previous Captain America movies. So it's nice just a few months later to be talking about a new Marvel movie that I thought definitely stepped it up and feels a little bit more in line with what made people fall in love with these characters and these stories. And I like the notion that we have a movie here that allows us to finally spend more time with some of these characters they've established, instead of them just kind of sitting on the sideline and being like, yeah, they teed up that character and did nothing with them. It's nice to have a movie here that fully integrates them into the MCU and makes them feel like an actual piece of the puzzle. And one last thing to say, there is a reason for why there is that asterisk in the title. A lot of people have already kind of speculated around that, and I know Kevin Feige kind of teased the fact that there is a reason behind the asterisk. I will say there is indeed. Having seen the film, there is a reason behind the asterisk for the title of the film. So that's all I'll say on that. Thunderbolts, are you planning on checking it out? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments down below, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.